Do you remember Ronald Reagan? Yeah, the 40th President of the United States of America. That Ronald Reagan. I can hear some of you Googling the name right now. That's alright, go ahead. I know some of you have only heard of Ronnie through classes at school, and that's okay too. He was president from 81 to 89, a conservative Republican. He was a convert, you might say. He was a Democrat right up until 1962, and then he flipped affiliations. I was a fan of Old Dutch long before he came president. Hell, before he was even governor of California. And I'm talking way back when he was a silver screen hero, saving the day and riding off into the golden sunsets with all the ladies' hearts. And that should give you a fair idea of my age, and at this stage in my life, a ballpark idea is good enough. There comes a time in life when the numbers stop mattering very much. You're just old. And that's where I am. Okay, now let me ask, have you heard about the Israeli spacecraft that was recently crashed into the moon on purpose? Now, I wager you have. It's made the news all around the world. If you haven't, go ahead and Google it. Take a look at the payload that spacecraft was carrying. And for those of you who aren't looking it up as I speak, well, I'll fill you in. The Israelis loaded the equivalent of 30 million pages worth of data about good old planet Earth into thin nickel sheets in the shape of a DVD and stuck it in there along with human DNA, plant and animal cells, and tiny creatures called tardigrades, or rather tons. That's what they're called when they go into their cryptobiosis state. The more popular name is water bears and moss pigs. They measure just under 1 millimeter in length, and they're the toughest damn animal we've found yet. Water bears were discovered in the 1700s by a German, so they're nothing new. They survived all 3 mass extinctions and can survive in extreme temperatures. We're talking from volcano hot to Antarctic, 20 degrees below Celsius cold. They simply curl in on themselves and expunge all the water from their bodies and go into that state of super hibernation. With their bodies preserved, they can later, decades and decades later, we found, rehydrate when their environment becomes tolerable again. They can withstand 10 times the radiation of humans, 6 times the pressure exerted on a body in the Mariana Trench. You know, that 30,000 feet deep trench in our ocean. The one we can't go explore because of the pressure. For water bears, it's just business as usual. Now, I guess you're wondering what the hell Ronald Reagan has to do with the Israeli spacecraft and its payload and water bears. Well, I hope all you youngsters didn't close down your Google pages just yet. Ronnie talked about a Star Wars program. To the public, it was a defense system he wanted to put into place to protect us against possible nuclear attack from the Soviet Union. The system was called High Frontier, and it would be implemented using the space shuttle. Satellites positioned and computer controlled, etc., etc. That's not the important part here. The important part is what you heard, or what you're hearing in the speeches if you searched it on the internet. It was not all of that program, not by a long shot. I worked for NASA back in the day, and during Ronald's presidency, he was not a man to set his sights on something and then not carry through with it. He would try even if it hair-lipped hell, and it did most of the time, but not nearly as much as the secret moon landings did in 1985 and 1987. Well, I could hear good old Google struggling and grinding to keep up with all those searches you just put in. Go ahead, I'm a patient man. But you won't find any manned lunar missions past what you were taught in school. December 1972. That was the last manned landing, my friends. Now, before you go doubting the legitimacy of what I said, let me ask you, do you believe in the tardigrades? Those cute little water bears? Well, sure you do, because you found it on the internet. Have you ever seen one with your own eyes? Well, I seriously doubt it. Does that make them any less real? No. So, just because you can't find proof of the manned lunar landings in 85 and 87 doesn't make them unreal. And this Israeli spacecraft was not the first to carry those miniature creatures to the moon with a whole shitload of plant and animal cells from planet Earth. That was the mission for the 1970. That's right. Another one you didn't know about. Landing. Those fine men placed them on the moon. Some samples were exposed, dumped right into the lunar soil, and others were not. They were more carefully placed. The alleged last mission in 1972 was just so a scientist could check up on the water bears. Nothing had changed. They were still in their ton state, dehydrated in stasis. So, their orders were to gather them, bury them at a carefully marked location along with the plant and animal cells, and get the hell back to Earth. There was fear of contamination, so they didn't bring them back. They weren't doing anything, not coming out of the stasis, not moving, nothing. So, there was no reason to bring them back and risk some alien bacterial outbreak that they could not have foreseen. Now, in 1985, Old Dutch organized a manned mission to the moon. He wanted a base of operations there for his high frontier security systems, and he wanted us to unload another batch of cells along with some data cylinders. We had to bury them, marking the coordinates, because he feared another country would go to the lunar surface and find out that we had been there long after the missions had been closed down. The cost was several $billion to send 3 men to the moon, so that was reason given for closing down that program. He was supposed to be spending all that extra money on the military. If people found out about covert moon landings, his ratings would have plummeted. The first mission went as President Reagan had hoped. Better even. No one involved was talking. There weren't even any rumors. He was a good distractor too, that Ronnie. One of the best. Like a fucking Houdini. He gets your attention focused on his right hand, and his left one plants a damn walrus right beside you, and you never see him do it. I think it was that silver screen smile and charisma he possessed. He didn't look like the fact that we probably would not have been able to put his base of operations on the moon, though. At the time, it would have been too expensive for the public not to find out about it. But he was bolstered by his ability to get away with the scientific endeavor. He wanted the payload brought back to Earth, and he wanted it studied. If the moon couldn't be used for the high frontier base, then we could store enough cells up there to regenerate the Earth's crops in a case of a catastrophic event. It sounds like the seed vault up on that Norwegian island, doesn't it? Except that in case of a worldwide cataclysm, that vault might be destroyed. Now, at the time, it was my job. I love my job. How many people can boast of having a job that takes them into outer space? That's my point. I was young enough to feel the thrill of working on a covert operation, and old enough to know it was a huge risk to us 3 men in the shuttle. We all understood the risks. If anything happened, we would be stranded up there until a rescue unit could be shuttled up to us. The trip takes almost 3 days, scrambling together another covert crew. Well, therein lies the rub, huh? The landing in 1987 was rough. The other 2 crew members died on impact, and the lander was damaged beyond anything I could conceivably repair by myself. Hell, even if Frank and Grimmer would have survived, I really don't think we could have repaired the old boat's structural damage. Comms worked just fine, as did most everything else, but the bashed-in side of the lander damaged the rocket engine needed to get us back to orbit and the shuttle. Like a good astronaut, I radioed in the problem. Like a good governmental covert operation master, ground control left me hanging with my ass in the wind, so to speak, for hours. Now, shall I go into drudging detail about my panic and terror? About the tears and thoughts of suicide, or how devastated I was that all three of us had gotten into that damned lander, on ground control's instruction and against our common sense. And now 2 of us had died. Or the revulsion I felt at having to deal with the corpses in the capsule. Well, no, not today. But it was there. For those hours of radio silence, they were bad. When control got back to me, I was relieved. They would scramble a crew and would arrive 3.5 days later. And all I had to do was survive until then. Survive and go gather up the payload from our last mission. It was heavily implied that my safe return depended upon it. The safety of the crew members depended on me keeping the payload secure and out of their sight. I assured Control that I would do my job. Following the coordinates, I located the mound where part of the payload had been buried. Except, it wasn't there. I went to the second location and it was the same story. Nothing there. And thinking we must have screwed up on the coordinates somehow, I widened the search around the original 2 areas. I had been there nearly 48 hours and had not found the first sign of the payload. Exhausted, I had to go into the shuttle for sleep. I woke 6 hours later and started the search again. The lunar soil, as we call it, isn't soil at all. It's called regolith, and it's fine as dust. That dust floats around you, suspended, clings to your suit, and just causes problems if you're immersed in too long. For that very reason, the things we buried were buried inside boreholes, and all we had to do was move the regolith over it. That means I should have been able to find them easily. The Apollo missions had the drills and did the hard work. It was nigh on the 72-hour mark when I gave up and radioed Control for a new set of coordinates. Obviously, ours were wrong. They gave me the coordinates of all the old boreholes and told me to check each one and to get a move on. Well, I did, and I found our payload all right. I found a huge hole staring up at me like a black unseeing eye of some long dead elder god, and I knew something had gone terribly wrong. The hole was big enough for me to step inside, and once inside, I could see the end of the hole. It widened out into an enormous cavern where low light emanated from an unseen source. Was I terrified of what I would find? Huh, you bet your boots I was. More terrified than I had ever been. But, well, I continued. I had to see who had fashioned this underground hold. Had the Russians also been sending people to the moon to set up some sort of base? If I sneaked down and saw who was there, or saw proof of who had done it, I would likely be lauded as a hero. It would be my turn to ride the silver screen and make the ladies swoon. If we ever broke cover and let civilians know about our little jaunts, that is. Now the cavern opened up and ran off into darkness, but I got the feeling of several large tunnels winnowing out and away from the lighted hub. But I didn't find Russians or people of any race in there. Now, you remember those water bears I told you about, and how we don't know all that they can do? Well, I got a first-hand look at what they can do. Whether they had help from unknowns was up for debate. I stepped around the outcroppings at the end of the tunnel and faced the direction of the dim light source. At first, I thought of Jules Verne's underground world of hollow earth. That was my mind trying to parse the information overload it just had received, though. And the illusion soon shattered, leaving me more horrified than ever. A pool of silvery liquid glowed with faint light from within. It didn't move like water. It was thicker, almost like a thick gel. Plants seemed to be sprouting from amorphous pods on its surface. And the plants seemed to move, but I couldn't be sure. I mean, it's not like there's wind on the moon, or liquid lakes, or life of any kind. My feet carried me closer, although my brain screamed for me to run in the other direction. I was like a man in a trance. As I moved toward the underground lake, I noted movement around the perimeter. Whirls of dust shot up into the air, and then it fell back to the ground. And I stopped. That wasn't supposed to happen on the moon. The bulbous lumps around which the dust flew up and settled again were unrecognizable. I had to force my eyes to focus on them. The body of shimmering liquid was still several hundred feet away. Dust plumed into the air and sifted back down again. I moved closer and saw the bulbous sentinel situated at even intervals around that gelatinous lake heavily resembling the water bears. The millimeter-long creatures had grown as large as men, and some even larger, almost reminiscent of Jabba the Hutt. The hydroponics growing operation was both ingenious and terrible. I mean, was it truly hydroponics? Well, I didn't exactly take samples, so your guess is as good as mine. The plants sprouted from floating pods. The pods were semi-living water bears, which were half the size of the sentinels. I knew instantly where all the samples from our payloads had gone. The scientists assured us the water bears could never come out of the tuned state, could not reproduce, could not live on the moon. They were supposed to remain in a state of superhibernation for the duration of the stay. Easing along the walls, I moved to within 100 feet of the nightmarish vision of those enormous tardigrades. Their cuteness was nowhere to be found. Their skin had thickened, resembling elephant hide, and was mostly transparent. My legs tired quickly as each step made me feel heavier and heavier. But I just thought it was fear making my muscles weaker. My legs tired quickly as each step made me feel heavier and heavier. But I just thought it was fear making my muscles weaker. It took a few minutes for me to realize I was getting really heavy. I stopped, confused, and leaned against the wall of the cave. The inside of my visor began to fog over, and I started to panic. Those monstrosities had created an atmosphere. Weak, granted, but still there. Something we were unable to do even with the best scientific minds and technological advancements. I backed away, my eyes still focusing on the greenery sprouting up from the luminous pods. They were moving again, but not from air movement. The plants moved of their own accord. The movement seemed familiar, but I couldn't place where I had ever seen anything like it before. Then a pod spun slowly so that its sprout faced me. From the top of a cornstalk, a baby's face stared blindly out, its mouth working, its skin a sickly amber color. I gasped and wanted to run, but again, my feet held me in place. I was unable to look away. The baby moved its head gently side to side, and its arms, stunted and covered with amber kernels, pulled away from its body to bat at the air before lying motionless against the washed-out green of the shucks. The sentinel's tongue shot out, and pushed the pod away. It spun so I couldn't see those blind eyes and malformed body. Another pod floated close, and I saw the stubby, chewed stalk of an unidentified plant sticking up. There was a new shoot growing beside it. It was pushed away as well. The next pod sprouted a tree-like shrub. The sentinel pulled it close and inspected the budding fruit. When it plucked a miniature goat with the semblance of a human face growing in its side, I felt bile rise. The hybrid kicked and flailed as the sentinel's tongue pulled it into its mouth. I backed away and into the tunnel, trying to run back to the defunct lander and the two dead men. After several minutes, I radioed control and told them I had found the payload. I didn't want them to scrub the rescue mission and leave my ass there. And yes, I fully believe they would have. I boarded the rescue lander under the watchful eyes of a man who surely had orders to leave me if I acted suspicious. My addled behavior was explained by low oxygen levels and having to remain in my suit for so long. I dragged the locked crate to the man, and he took up the handle, loading it. By that time, I was nearly too weak to stand on my own. I only spoke when I had to on the way back to re-entry. I was hospitalized in a secret underground facility upon return, and I was grilled by superiors about the empty crate. I babbled as if I were a madman. I kept up the ruse until I was placed into an asylum for people who didn't officially exist. And that facility was home for 5 long years. One day, bleeding over into the other. My pretend madness becoming more and more real to my mind until I feared I would slip over the edge and actually become crazy. Ronald came to visit me by himself one day. No entourage of Secret Service protection, just him. He asked me about the mission. I remained mute and even added a little drool to fix my broken state in his mind. It didn't work. He laughed and gave me that silver screen smile as he leaned over the table to speak. You're not crazy. Your mind isn't broken. The doctors have known for a long time now. So, speak to me, son. Tell me what you saw up there. Shocked, I shook my head and said, Don't go back there. Ever. I didn't dare say any more. He nodded solemnly. They were alive and thriving, weren't they? It was amazing. He tapped his coat pocket. Your video feed was damaged. Don't worry about that. It was for my eyes only, son. All I got were some grainy images shot through the lines and static. My heart fell into my feet. I hadn't even thought of the video feed wired into my suit. I'd forgotten it for all those years. I guess the horrors I saw up there were to blame, and then, on Earth again, I was so focused on pretending to be crazy that I had never entered my mind. Ronnie came to visit me twice more, and I finally confided in him. He was no longer president, but he still had powers to get things done. On his last visit, he handed me an envelope and told me to disappear when I was released the next day. I agreed. I didn't use the new identity he gave me. I went to Tennessee and painstakingly swapped out all the cash he had given me, too. I dumped the rest of the papers into a trash bin outside of Piggly Wiggly and went to Texas. And I've remained here all the years since. I lived a good life for someone in hiding. But I have no doubt that after this little story hits the internet, they'll see to it that I am found and shut up for good. I'm too old to go running off in search of another dusty hideout now. I'm just an old man who doesn't exist in the exotic memories of a mission that never happened. No, officially anyway. At least the truth is out. At least you have an idea not to believe every damn thing you're spoon-fed by the internet or even history books. Learn to question everything, and make up your own mind about things.